An American fighter jet falls out of the sky over Iran. One pilot is missing, another is pulled from the ocean after his A-10 goes down near the Strait of Hormuz. And yet, officials still claim the skies are under control. You're being told this is victory, that America dominates the air, that slow, aging war machines like the A-10 are flying freely over one of the most heavily defended countries on Earth. And on paper, it looks undeniable. Thousands of targets hit, most of Iran's air defenses shattered, its navy crippled. But here's what they don't say out loud. If the sky is truly safe, why are aircraft still falling? Why are rescue missions turning into combat zones? Why is the war getting more dangerous, not less? Behind the headlines, something doesn't add up. This isn't the clean, overwhelming victory it's being sold as. It's something far more unstable. And if you look closer, really look, you'll see the cracks forming in real time. He didn't just start a war, he started it alone. That's the part no one wants to say clearly. While American aircraft push deeper into Iranian airspace, something else is happening behind the scenes, something far more dangerous. Allies are stepping back, quietly, deliberately. Donald Trump moves fast, almost impulsively. Reports again. And now, instead of a united front, there's hesitation, even frustration. At one point, he publicly called on allies to send ships into the region, then, almost in the same breath, dismissed their importance entirely. He even floated the idea of pulling the United States out of NATO, labeling it a paper tiger. I've seen this gazarm before in conflicts, not the military side, but the political fracture that comes right after. The first wave of strikes, it's subtle at first. No dramatic announcements, just silence where support should be. And that silence is getting louder, because here's the reality. Wars like this aren't won by air power alone. They rely on alliances, logistics, shared risk. And right now, that foundation is cracking. Europe is hesitant. Some countries are outright resisting involvement. Others are watching, calculating, waiting to see if this spirals out of control. Meanwhile, Trump doubles down. More pressure, more threats, more unpredictability. But unpredictable coalition, it erodes them. And as the military campaign intensifies, the political isolation becomes impossible to ignore. So you have this strange, almost surreal situation. On one hand, American forces appear dominant in the skies. On the other, the country itself is drifting further from the very allies it would need if this war expands. And that raises a question I can't shake. If this escalates beyond airstrikes, who is actually going to stand with the United States? The ultimatum did not come quietly. It arrived like at a countdown ticking in the background of an already unstable war. 48 hours, that was the window. Open the Strait of Hormuz or face consequences. That, in his own words, would unleash all hell. From the outside, it sounded like strength, decisiveness, a clear line drawn in the sand. But beneath that surface, the situation was far more volatile. Because deadlines in war are rarely just deadlines. They are pressure points. And this one was aimed directly at the most sensitive choke point in the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz is not just water. Nearly 20% of the world's traded oil passes through it every single day. Tankers move through that narrow corridor like a constant lifeline for global markets. Disrupt it, and the effects ripple instantly. And not just in the Middle East, but in gas prices, supply chains, and economies across the world. And right now, that lifeline is barely functioning. Commercial shipping has slowed to a crawl. Insurance costs for vessels have surged. Oil prices have already climbed past $100 per barrel, reacting not just to physical disruption, but to fear, the kind of fear that spreads faster than any missile. Iran's response to the ultimatum only deepened the tension. Officials rejected the demand outright, calling it reckless and unbalanced. There was no sign of compliance, no indication that pressure would work. Instead, the message was clear. They would not reopen the strait under threat. That is where the real danger begins. Because when an ultimatum fails, the next step is escalation. An escalation in this context does not mean a symbolic strike or a limited response. It means targeting infrastructure, expanding operations, and potentially dragging more actors into the conflict. The uncertainty is amplified by inconsistency. Deadlines have shifted before. Statements have contradicted each other. Signals coming from leadership change rapidly, making it difficult for allies and adversaries, and to predict what happens next. And in a high-stakes environment like this, unpredictability is not an advantage. It is a risk multiplier. As the clock runs down, the situation becomes less about the strait and more about what happens when it doesn't. Every hour that passes tightens the pressure. Every ship that hesitates adds to the economic strain. Every public statement raises the stakes. This is no longer just a military confrontation. It is a high-risk standoff where timing, perception, and miscalculation could trigger consequences far beyond the region. And as that 48-hour window closes, the world is left watching a single question unfold in real time. What happens when a deadline meets defiance? This is where the story stops being about missiles and starts becoming about you. Not in theory, but in a very real, very measurable way. Because the center of gravity in this entire conflict isn't just airspace or military dominance. It's a narrow strip of water most people had never even thought about before this war began, the Strait of Hormuz. He sees it as leverage, a choke point, a place where pressure can be applied until the other side bends. And from a purely strategic perspective, that logic makes sense. Control the bottleneck, control the flow, control the flow, control the outcome. But what's unfolding right now is proving that control cuts both ways. You have to understand just how critical this passage is. Roughly 1 of every 5 barrels of oil traded globally moves through this corridor. Not someday, not occasionally, every single day. It is one of the most important arteries in the entire global system, and right now that artery is constricted dramatically. Some vessels are rerouting entirely. Insurance premiums for tankers have surged to levels that make certain routes almost unviable, and the markets are reacting in real time. Oil prices have already pushed past $110 per barrel, not just because of what has happened, but because of what might happen next. Fear is now part of the equation, and fear is something markets price in immediately. He may frame this as a regional conflict, but the consequences are anything but regional, because when everything follows. Transportation costs rise, goods be more expensive, supply chains tighten, and before long, you're not just watching a war. You're feeling it at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and the cost of everyday life. I've seen how quickly this kind of pressure builds. It doesn't hit all at once, it creeps in. A few cents more per gallon, slight delays in shipments, subtle price increases that people notice but can't quite explain. And then suddenly, it's everywhere. A full-scale economic ripple that started in a place most people couldn't point to, on a map. Meanwhile, governments around the world are scrambling. UAE is already signaling that any future deal must guarantee access through Hormuz. European nations are discussing emergency measures, including potential windfall taxes on energy companies profiting from the spike. Everyone is adjusting, reacting, trying to contain something that is fundamentally difficult to contain. And that's the paradox at the heart of this moment. The more pressure applied to force control over the strait, the more unstable the entire system becomes. It's not a simple equation of dominance anymore. It's a fragile balance where every move creates unintended consequences. So while aircraft dominate the skies above, the real battle is unfolding here. In the oil markets and in economic forecasts, in the invisible systems that keep the world running. And whether you realize it or not, you're already part of that battlefield. They call it air supremacy. That's the phrase being repeated in briefings, in headlines, and analysis. A clean, decisive term that suggests control, dominance, even inevitability. And on the surface, the numbers seem to support it. Within the first 24 hours of the campaign, roughly 80% of Iran's air defense systems were reportedly destroyed or disabled. Thousands of targets have been struck since then, some estimates pushing beyond 10,000 individual sites. Major radar installations gone, missile batteries neutralized, command centers hit repeatedly. It looks overwhelming. It sounds overwhelming. And then there's the part that really drives the narrative home. Aircraft like the A-10 Warthog, slow, low-flying, designed for close support. Not survival in contested airspace, are now operating inside Iranian territory. Apache helicopters, even more vulnerable, flying strike missions. These are not the platforms you send into danger. These are the platforms you send in after the danger is supposed to be gone. He sees this as proof. Proof that the skies are effectively theirs, proof that Iran's defenses have collapsed. To the point where even legacy aircraft can operate freely. And if you're just looking at the surface, it's hard to argue against that conclusion. But this is where things start to feel incomplete. Because despite all of that, despite the destruction, the numbers, the apparent dominance, the war isn't slowing down. It's accelerating. You can see it in the contradictions. Missile launches from Iran may be down by around 90%, but they haven't stopped. Drone attacks are still happening. Fast attack boats are still being deployed in the Strait of Hormuz. And perhaps most importantly, American aircraft are still being hit. I keep coming back to that point because it doesn't fit the narrative. If the airspace is truly controlled, why are there still losses? Why are pilots still being rescued from hostile territory? Why are isolated defense systems, the remnants of what was supposedly destroyed, still capable of inflicting damage? The answer is uncomfortable. Air supremacy in this case may not mean what people think it means. It doesn't mean zero threat. It doesn't mean safety. It means reduced resistance. Fragmented, disorganized, but still present. And in some ways, that's even more dangerous. Because a broken system doesn't behave predictably. It doesn't respond in coordinated ways. It becomes scattered, reactive, harder to track. Small pockets of resistance that don't follow a central command can still create real consequences. A shoulder-fired missile here, a hidden launcher there. Enough to remind everyone that control is never absolute, and that's the illusion taking shape. On paper, dominance. In reality, a battlefield that is still very much alive. Still capable of pushing back. Still unpredictable. So when you hear the phrase air supremacy, you have to ask yourself what it actually represents. Is it total control or just the absence of organized defense? Is it victory or simply the beginning of a new, more chaotic phase of the war? Because right now, everything suggests this isn't the end of resistance. It's just the point where that resistance becomes harder to see and far more dangerous to underestimate. A deal appears suddenly, almost quietly, in the middle of all this noise. Not announced with certainty, not confirmed with confidence, but circulating just enough to catch attention. A proposed ceasefire, 45 days, temporary, conditional, fragile. He looks at it as an option, a pause button in a conflict that is moving faster than anyone can comfortably control. On paper, it sounds simple. Stop the fighting, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, create space for negotiation. But wars like this don't pause cleanly. They bleed into every condition attached to them. You might hear ceasefire and think stability is coming, that the worst is over. But when you look closer, the reality is far more complicated. Because this proposal isn't built on agreement. It's built on demands. The terms are already creating friction. Iran is signaling that reopening Hormuz cannot come without guarantees, not just temporary relief, but long-term security. And more importantly, relief from sanctions that have defined its economic reality for years. From their perspective, why give up leverage without gaining something permanent in return? On the other side, there is pressure to act quickly, reopen the strait, stabilize markets, reduce global tension. But speed and strategy don't always align. A rushed agreement can solve today's crisis, while setting up tomorrow's conflict. I've watched situations like this unfold before, and there's always a moment where the idea of peace feels close, almost within reach, but never fully solid. That's exactly where this is right now, close enough to talk about, too unstable to trust. And here's where it gets even more uncertain. There's no clear guarantee that either side actually wants a full stop. A pause, maybe, a repositioning, a chance to regroup, reassess, prepare for what comes next. But a true resolution, that's much harder to find. Because even during discussions of a ceasefire, the fighting doesn't fully stop. Strikes continue, drones are still launched, military assets are still being moved into position. It's like two tracks running at the same time. Diplomacy on the surface. Escalation is building underneath. You can feel that tension if you pay attention. The language used publicly sounds controlled, measured. But the actions tell a different story. And when those two things don't match, it's a sign that something is still unresolved. He may see this proposal as a strategic opening, a way to claim progress, to reduce pressure, to shift the narrative. But if the underlying conflict hasn't changed, and if the core demands remain incompatible, then what this really becomes is a delay, not a solution. So when you hear that a ceasefire is on the table, you have to ask yourself what it actually represents. Is this the beginning of the end, or just a brief pause before everything intensifies again? Because right now, it doesn't feel like peace is arriving. It feels like the war is catching its breath. They say Iran has been pushed to the brink, that its defenses are shattered, its systems crippled, its ability to fight back reduced to fragments. And yes, there is truth in that. The numbers are hard to ignore. Missile launches have dropped dramatically, in some estimates by nearly 90%. Major air defense networks have been dismantled. Key infrastructure has been hit, again and again. From the outside, it looks like a country on the edge of collapse. But that's not the full picture, not even close, because what remains is harder to see and far more dangerous to underestimate. He understands this differently, not as defeat, but as adaptation. When centralized systems are destroyed, what's left doesn't disappear. It changes form. Instead of coordinated defense, you get scattered resistance. Smaller units, independent operations, less visible, less predictable, but still very much active. You can already see it happening. Drone attacks are continuing, not at the scale they once were, but enough to maintain pressure. Fast attack boats are still moving through the Strait of Hormuz, harassing shipping routes, forcing responses, keeping that corridor unstable. These are not signs of a defeated force. They are signs of a force adjusting to survive. I've seen this pattern before in other conflicts. When a military loses its structured capabilities, it doesn't simply stop fighting. It becomes irregular. And irregular threats are often more difficult to deal with because they don't follow expectations. They don't present themselves in ways that can be easily targeted or neutralized. And then there's the underground factor, the part that rarely makes headlines but changes everything. Much of Iran's remaining capability is believed to be hidden, dispersed, protected in ways that are not immediately accessible to air power alone. Missile systems, drone infrastructure, supply chains not fully destroyed, just harder to reach. That creates a dangerous illusion. On one side, overwhelming visible success. On the other, invisible resilience. You might hear that Iran is weakened, and that's true. But weakened does not mean incapable. It does not mean finished, and it certainly does not mean safe. Because a force that knows it cannot win, it shifts strategy. It looks for pressure points instead of direct confrontation. It targets vulnerabilities. Economic, logistical, psychological. And in this case, one of those vulnerabilities is already obvious, the Strait of Hormuz. So while the narrative focuses on what has been destroyed, the more important question is what remains and how it will be used. He may not have the same defenses, he may not have the same structure, but he still has options. And sometimes, in conflicts like this, it's not the strongest force that dictates what happens next. It's the one that refuses to collapse. This is the part no one wants to say out loud. The part that doesn't fit neatly into headline as about air dominance or collapsing defenses. Because beyond the airstrikes, beyond the ultimatums, there is a scenario forming slowly, quietly, that could change everything. Boots on the ground. He doesn't announce it directly, not yet, but the pieces are already moving into place. Plans are being discussed, briefings are happening, and the objective is becoming clearer. Deep inside Iran, there are stockpiles that cannot be destroyed from the air alone. Highly enriched uranium, nearly 970 pounds of it, stored in fortified underground facilities, buried hundreds of feet below the surface. Airstrikes can damage the entrances, disrupt operations. But they can't fully eliminate what's hidden that deep. And that's where the conversation shifts. Because if something cannot be destroyed remotely, it has to be reached physically. Excavation equipment, engineering units, secure perimeters, temporary runways for transport aircraft. This is no longer about quick strikes or surgical missions. This is about presence, sustained presence. You might think this is still hypothetical, just contingency planning. But look at the movement. Marine expeditionary units are already being positioned. Additional forces are being deployed. Support assets, logistics chains, command structures, all the quiet signals that something larger is being prepared. I've seen how this unfolds. It never starts with a full declaration. Limited objectives, targeted operations, short-term deployments, and then those operations expand. Because once forces are on the ground, the mission rarely stays small. It adapts, it grows, it gets complicated. And here's the risk no one can ignore. Ground operations inside a country like Iran are not quick, they are not clean. Terrain, population density, underground infrastructure, remaining resistance, all of it turns a limited mission into a prolonged engagement. Weeks can become months. Months can become something else entirely. You can already feel the tension in the planning itself. On one side, urgency, secure the material, eliminate the threat. On the other, hesitation, because once that step is taken, there is no easy way back. He may see it as the final move, the step that ends the uncertainty, but history suggests otherwise. Ground wars don't end uncertainty, they multiply it. And for you, this is where the conflict changes shape completely. It stops being a distant series of airstrikes and becomes something deeper, longer, more unpredictable. Because once troops are on the ground, the timeline disappears, the cost increases, the stakes rise. So the question is no longer whether this war is escalating. It already is. The real question is whether this next step, the one no one wants to confirm, is already inevitable. What's happening now is bigger than the battlefield, bigger than Iran, bigger than the United States. Because while missiles fly and ultimatums dominate headlines, something deeper is shifting. Quietly but unmistakably across the global system. He may still frame this as a controlled operation, a regional conflict with defined objectives, but the reaction tells a very different story. From the rest of the world, tells a very different story. Governments are not just watching, they're adjusting, recalculating, preparing for a future that looks increasingly unstable. In Europe, discussions are already underway about emergency economic measures. Some nations are pushing for windfall taxes on energy companies as oil prices surge past $110 per barrel. Not as a long-term policy, but as a response to a crisis that is unfolding faster than expected. That alone tells you how seriously this is being taken. At the same time, trust is beginning to erode. Quietly at first, but noticeably. Allies that once aligned automatically are now hesitating. Some are openly questioning decisions. Others are choosing distance instead of involvement. The idea of collective response, the foundation of alliances like NATO, is starting to fracture under pressure. You can see it in the tone, in the hesitation, in the lack of unified action. And then there's the economic shift. Because when a region as critical as the Persian Gulf becomes unstable, the world doesn't just react politically, it adapts structurally. Countries begin accelerating plans that once felt optional. Renewable energy, alternative supply routes, diversification strategies. Not because they want to, but because they feel they have to. I've watched this pattern before. Crisis forces change, faster than policy ever could. What would have taken years suddenly happens in months, sometimes weeks. And once those shifts begin, they don't fully reverse. That's the part most people miss. This war isn't just about who wins or loses on the battlefield. It's about what the world looks like after it's over. Because if global supply chains reroute, if energy strategies fundamentally change, if alliances weaken or realign, then the impact of this conflict doesn't end when the fighting stops. It continues, quietly shaping decisions, markets, and power structures for years to come. You might not feel all of that immediately. It doesn't hit like an explosion or a headline. It builds over time, but it's already in motion. And that raises a much bigger question than anything happening in the skies or at sea. Not just who wins this war, But what kind of world is left when it's over? I want you to pause for a second and really think about what you've just seen. Not just the headlines, not just the explosions, not just the claims of dominance abyss, but the pattern underneath all of it. Because when you connect the dots, this doesn't look like a war that's stabilizing. It looks like one that's still building momentum. I've walked you through the pieces. Aircraft falling despite control, allies stepping back instead of stepping in, a global oil choke point under pressure, a ceasefire that no one fully trusts, and now the possibility of boots on the ground. None of those things point to an ending. They point to a turning point. And here's where it becomes personal for you. Because wars like this don't stay contained. They don't politely remain in one region and leave the rest of the world untouched. They spread economically, politically, psychologically. You may not hear the missiles, but you will feel the consequences. In prices, in policy, in the way the world starts to shift around you. I keep coming back to one simple question. What happens next? Not what should happen, but what actually will. Because right now, everything depends on a few decisions that haven't been made yet. A strait that may or may not reopen. A military step that may or may not be taken. A line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. You're watching this unfold in real time. And the truth is, no one, not analysts, not leaders, not even the people directly involved, fully knows how this ends. So I'll leave you with this. If this is what escalation looks like, are we already past the point where it can be stressed back?